Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
I want to begin today's episode with something simple, something almost universal. That small lift you feel when someone compliments you. That sigh of relief when someone says, "You did well." That moment of checking your phone to see if someone responded, liked your post, or even just acknowledged your message. It may feel like nothing, or everything. But behind each of those small moments is something deeply human. The need to be seen, to be accepted, to be affirmed. Today we're talking about why we seek validation, why we crave approval, praise, and acknowledgement, and what that says about our psychological wiring, our development, and even our culture. This isn't just about people-pleasing or low self-esteem. It's something much more foundational. Because whether we're conscious of it or not, most of us carry within us a kind of radar, always scanning, always searching. Do they like me? Do they approve? Am I accepted here? You're not weak for needing that. You're human. The need for validation, for a sense of mattering in the eyes of others, is hardwired into the way we develop as social beings. It's part of the glue that has held communities, families, and even civilizations together. But like most things in psychology, what once helped us survive can sometimes hurt us when it becomes the only lens through which we view ourselves. So in this episode, we're going to unpack the roots of that need, from early attachment to modern social media, and we'll explore how to understand it without shame, how to distinguish healthy connection from emotional dependency, and how to begin cultivating a sense of worth that doesn't disappear when the applause stops. Whether you've wrestled with this yourself, or watched someone else unravel under the weight of unmet validation, this conversation is for you. So, settle in. Let's begin not by judging the need to be seen, but by understanding it. Because in that understanding, there is freedom. Let's start with the truth I've come to accept, not just from the literature or the classroom, but from lived experience. We all want to be seen, not just noticed, but truly seen, understood, recognized, affirmed. We want to believe that our presence in the world registers in the minds and hearts of others. This need doesn't make us weak or superficial. It makes us human. In fact, the desire to be accepted by others is so foundational to our psychology that it shows up in our biology. Social neuroscientists have found that rejection, being excluded, ignored, or dismissed, activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. Think about that. Your brain processes being left out, much like it processes being physically hurt. That's not metaphor. That's neurology. And there's a reason for it. Psychologists Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary famously argued that the need to belong is not just a want, it's a primary human motivation. They called it a pervasive drive to form and maintain at least a minimum quantity of lasting, positive, and significant interpersonal relationships. Their theory suggests that forming social bonds isn't optional. It's a core part of who we are. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Early humans survived by sticking together. Being part of the group meant access to food, protection, warmth. But being excluded, that could mean death. So our brains adapted to interpret social cues with exquisite sensitivity. Are we in or out? Are we safe or unsafe? And that old software is still running, even though the threats have changed. Of course, we're no longer fending off predators in tribes of 30, but our nervous systems haven't evolved as quickly as our technologies. So now we're scrolling through social media, checking for likes, replies, and digital acknowledgement with the same ancient wiring that once helped us avoid exile. Every ping, every read receipt, Every comment or lack thereof, our brains register it as data about our standing in the group. I remember a moment years ago, something small, but it stuck. I was leading a graduate seminar, and one of the students who rarely spoke finally shared a comment. It was thoughtful, clearly the product of deep reflection. But no one responded. Not a nod, not a follow-up, just silence. And I watched, in real time, the way he sank back into himself, retreating as though his voice had confirmed its own irrelevance. After class, I caught up with him. I asked how he felt about the discussion. He smiled faintly and said, "I guess I thought it would matter more when I finally spoke." What he needed in that moment wasn't praise. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. That someone heard him. That his presence was real and meaningful. And that moment, his pulling back, wasn't about ego. It was about survival. The social kind. The kind that tells us, you belong here. Validation, at its most essential, is that. It's the nervous system saying, am I safe in this group? Do I matter to these people? Will I be included or cast out? When we look at it that way, the need for approval becomes something much deeper than vanity. It becomes a signal, a checking system, rooted in our biology and shaped by our social context. And here's where things get complicated. Because while this need once helped us form strong bonds and cohesive communities, in today's world, especially in Western individualistic cultures, it can turn against us. The sheer number of people we interact with, the fragmentation of identity across platforms, the rapid pace of communication, all of it overwhelms that ancient need for belonging. Now, instead of just checking for approval from our family, our village, or our close peers, we're seeking validation from everyone, strangers, audiences, algorithms. And as the circle of perceived judgment expands, so does the pressure. If you're listening to this and thinking, well, I don't really care what people think, I invite you to pause. Because even the belief that we shouldn't care is a reflection of how much the idea of being independent from others' opinions is culturally praised. Ironically, not caring can become another kind of performance, one we hope others will admire. So how do we begin to sort this out? How do we recognize when our need for validation is healthy, when it's part of our social nature, and when it becomes compulsive, even damaging? That's where we'll head next. But for now, I want you to hear this clearly. Your need to be acknowledged is not a flaw. It's not a defect in your personality or a weakness of character. It's the echo of something old, something protective. And like all echoes, it can guide us or mislead us, depending on how well we understand where it's coming from. Let's keep going. If the need for validation is part of our wiring, then the way we seek it, how urgently, how consistently, how desperately or cautiously, we learn that somewhere. And for many of us, it begins long before we have the words to explain what we're looking for. This is where early relationships matter. In psychology, attachment theory helps us understand the blueprint we develop for how relationships work, beginning in infancy. John Bowlby, one of the founding figures of this theory, believed that we are born with a biological drive to form attachments because, simply put, proximity to a caregiver increases our chances of survival. But how those caregivers respond, whether with attunement or dismissal, warmth or unpredictability, starts to shape how we view ourselves and others. Think about the infant who cries and is quickly soothed. Over time, that baby learns something powerful. My needs matter. When I reach out, someone comes. That's not just comforting, it's instructive. It builds a core belief that the world is responsive and that I am worth responding to. Now think about the infant whose cries are met with inconsistency, sometimes comforted, sometimes ignored, or worse, with irritation or ridicule. That child begins to develop a different internal story. I might need to work harder to be loved. Or maybe I'm only acceptable when I'm quiet, pleasing, or perfect. Over time, those beliefs crystallize into patterns that often last into adulthood, even when the original caregiver is long gone. Insecure attachment, whether avoidant, anxious, or disorganized, can produce a kind of emotional hypervigilance. It creates an inner radar, always scanning for signs of approval or rejection, Not just in romantic relationships, but in friendships, at work, online, even in casual interactions. The stakes always feel a little too high. The silence always a little too loud. I once worked with a young woman, let's call her Claire, who was brilliant, articulate, and deeply committed to personal growth. On the surface, she seemed confident, even bold. But in our sessions, a different story emerged. Every decision she made, from the clothes she wore to the way she spoke in meetings, was filtered through an invisible question: will they approve of me? She had spent her childhood being praised only for her accomplishments, never for who she was. Straight A's were applauded, quiet compliance was rewarded, but emotions, vulnerability, expression without performance, those were met with discomfort or silence. So Claire learned to earn her value. And like many people with anxious attachment styles, she became what the research calls other-validated, meaning her sense of self-worth lived almost entirely outside of her. As long as the approval kept coming, she felt okay, but the moment there was criticism, or even neutrality, she unraveled. She's not alone. Many of us grew up in households where love was conditional, where praise was only given for obedience or success, not for authenticity, or where criticism was constant, and affection came sparingly. And even if our parents or guardians didn't mean to harm us, their own unprocessed wounds often left us starved for acknowledgement. Family systems theory reminds us that these patterns don't happen in isolation. They're passed down, inherited, reenacted. A parent who withholds praise might have grown up believing that too much affirmation would make a child arrogant. Or a caregiver who overpraises performance might genuinely believe that's the best way to raise a high achiever, unaware of the emotional toll it can take. Validation, in those early years, teaches us what it means to exist in the eyes of others, and whether we learn to expect love or to chase it, to rest in connection or to earn it constantly, we carry those blueprints into every relationship that follows. Now, that doesn't mean we're doomed by our childhoods, but we are shaped by them. Understanding where our need for validation began can be a powerful turning point. It allows us to step back from self-blame and start to see our patterns as adaptations, not flaws. If you found yourself constantly looking outward to feel okay inside, there's a good chance that behavior once served a purpose. It kept you safe. It helped you stay connected to the people you depended on. But now, as adults, we have the chance to choose differently. In the next section, we'll explore that shift, how we move from defining ourselves through the eyes of others to learning how to validate ourselves. Not in an empty, self-help kind of way, but in a grounded, psychological sense that reflects inner stability. We'll talk about the tension between external and internal validation, and how to navigate that tension without collapsing under it. But before we go there, I'll say this. If you grew up feeling unseen, you are not imagining it. And if you're still searching for that recognition, even in subtle ways, that doesn't make you needy. It makes you someone who learned to survive through connection. And survival is not weakness, it's intelligence, it's instinct, and it's something we can build upon. Let's talk next about how. By now, we've laid the groundwork. We've looked at the deep evolutionary roots of our need to belong, and the ways early relationships sculpt the shape of that longing. Now we turn toward the center of the modern struggle, that tightrope walk between the validation we seek from others and the sense of worth we cultivate within ourselves. Let's start with something simple but important. Validation isn't bad. It's not wrong to want recognition. In fact, healthy relationships are built on mutual affirmation, a kind word, a gesture of appreciation, someone noticing your effort. Those moments can sustain us. We are social creatures. We respond to being seen. The problem arises when external validation becomes our only mirror, when the question, "Am I doing well?" always has to be answered by someone else. When we can't rest in a decision unless it's been co-signed. When the absence of praise feels like the presence of failure. I had a student once, let's call him Jeremy, who came to me after class in tears. He'd turned in a brilliant research paper, and I'd given him an A with a single note. This was strong. Let's talk more in office hours. He'd read the comment and spiraled. Not because it was critical, but because it wasn't effusive. No glowing paragraph. No detailed affirmation. And that silence, just a few missing sentences, made him feel like he'd done something wrong. We talked, and what he revealed was this. Growing up, praise wasn't just important. It was currency. It was how he knew he existed. Every good grade was a handshake. Every gold star, a breath of relief. And now, in adulthood, he felt like he was constantly trying to buy his own reflection from other people. That phrase stuck with me. Buying your reflection. It's what happens when we can't see ourselves unless someone else hands us a mirror. And if we're not careful, we become dependent on those mirrors. We contort ourselves to win approval. And if that approval stops coming, we feel like we've disappeared. This is where the work begins. Carl Rogers, one of the great humanistic psychologists, introduced a concept called unconditional positive regard. He believed that in order to grow, people need to feel accepted, not only when they succeed, but when they struggle, when they're messy, confused, or imperfect. Unfortunately, many of us never received that kind of regard. We were praised when we pleased, when we performed, when we aligned with expectations, not when we questioned, failed, or stood still. So we began to think of worthiness as something earned, not inherent. And as adults, that belief follows us quietly into our relationships, our careers, even our online lives. Social media compounds the problem. It gives us numbers, metrics, a visible scoreboard for how liked or valued we are or aren't. Every like, every comment, every repost becomes a microdose of external validation. And because it's intermittent, we keep chasing it, like gamblers at a slot machine. We never know which post will land, which version of ourselves will resonate. So we curate, we filter, we optimize. We shape ourselves for maximum affirmation and sometimes minimum truth. This is not a personal failure. It's a systemic effect. We're living in a culture that trains us to see validation as performance. But performance isn't the same as identity, and applause isn't the same as love. The pivot, psychologically speaking, is toward internal validation. That means cultivating a relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on being watched. It means asking, do I value what I just did, before asking, will they? It means becoming your own reliable narrator rather than outsourcing your story to the crowd. This is not easy, especially if you've spent your life being praised for meeting others' needs or living up to their hopes. But it is possible. And it starts with noticing. Noticing when you shift who you are for approval. Noticing when silence makes you question your value. Noticing when you feel invisible and assuming it's because you've done something wrong. From there, it takes practice. Writing down your own wins before others can name them. Speaking your opinion even when it may not be popular. Sitting with discomfort when approval doesn't come. And staying rooted anyway. And maybe most importantly, learning to listen for your own voice, not just the echo of applause. Let me say something here that might feel foreign at first. You are allowed to validate yourself. You are allowed to say, that was kind, or that was brave, or even just, that mattered. You don't need an audience to make your experience real. You don't need permission to be proud. The more you begin to trust that inner voice, the less you'll fear silence. Because silence won't mean absence anymore. It will mean space. Space to be rather than to perform. In the next part of our conversation, we're going to look closely at the way social media distorts and inflates our hunger for validation, and how to begin reclaiming that hunger without shame. We'll talk about social comparison, psychological addiction to feedback loops, and the very modern paradox of being watched constantly, yet feeling unseen. But for now, remember this. External validation can be beautiful, but it was never meant to be your only source of light. You have your own. Let's find it again. So let's step into the world where validation isn't just a quiet hope. It's a daily performance, a stage, a scoreboard, a curated stream of applause and silence. I'm talking, of course, about social media, that sprawling, pixelated mirror we now check to see if we're still real. There's no doubt that platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook have given us new ways to connect, express, even belong. But they've also intensified something ancient: the desire to be seen, to be affirmed, to be acknowledged in ways that are measurable. In the span of a few hours, we can go from feeling like we matter to wondering if we're invisible, all based on how people react or don't to what we've shared. Now here's where the psychology deepens. Back in the 1950s, Leon Festinger introduced what's known as social comparison theory. He argued that in the absence of objective ways to evaluate ourselves, we turn to others. We ask, consciously or not, how am I doing compared to them? Am I attractive enough? Smart enough? Successful enough? And if we perceive others as doing better, it can breed envy, self-doubt, even shame. Social media didn't invent this, it just magnified it. It gives us endless others to compare ourselves to, and it gives us edited, filtered, highly selective versions of their lives. We're not comparing reality to reality, we're comparing our backstage to their highlight reel. And that's a game no one wins. I've spoken to clients and students who describe this quiet spiral that begins after posting something personal, a vacation photo, a celebration, a moment of vulnerability. They check the response. It's slower than expected. Fewer likes than usual. Maybe one or two comments. And suddenly the mind goes, was that too much? Do I look foolish? Am I being ignored? And most painful of all, do I matter less than I thought I did? This is not just insecurity, it's intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful psychological forces we know. B.F. Skinner discovered that when a reward is unpredictable, when it happens sometimes but not always, it actually increases the behavior. That's why gambling is addictive. You don't win every time, but just enough to keep playing. Social media uses the same principle. You don't get validation every time you post, but you get it often enough to keep checking, keep posting, keep hoping. We become trapped in what I sometimes call the applause algorithm, not just seeking validation, but performing for it, adjusting our voice, our appearance, even our identity to fit the trends of the day. And the trouble is, the applause is always moving. The goalposts shift. What was liked last week might be ignored today. What drew admiration yesterday might draw criticism tomorrow. It's exhausting, and it chips away at our authenticity. There's also something deeper happening beneath the surface. We confuse visibility with value. If people are watching, we must be important. If no one's reacting, we must be insignificant. But those two things aren't the same. Attention is not affection. Popularity is not purpose. And being seen is not the same as being understood. A young man I worked with, let's call him Mateo, once said to me, "I have 2 million followers, and I've never felt lonelier." His entire career was built on being watched. But what he was really longing for wasn't attention, it was connection. The kind where you don't have to be liked to be loved. The kind where silence doesn't equal rejection. The kind where you can stop performing and just be. Now, I'm not suggesting we all abandon the internet or stop posting our joys and ideas. What I am saying is this: we have to reclaim the meaning of validation. To remember that it doesn't have to come with metrics, that a quiet, private sense of worth matters more than 1,000 likes from people who don't actually know you. That presence is more important than performance. So if you find yourself compulsively checking or second-guessing your posts or reshaping yourself to win digital approval, you're not weak. You're responding to a powerful psychological system. But the more aware we become of the system, the more choice we have in how we engage with it. In the next part of our journey, we'll talk about what happens when the need for validation turns into a trap, when it dominates our decisions, when it dilutes our selfhood, when it becomes a dependency we can't seem to shake. We'll look at what it means to lose ourselves in pursuit of approval and how to begin coming home again. But for now, I want to offer this. If you're watching yourself through a digital mirror, waiting for proof that you're enough, take a breath, step back. You are not the number on the screen. You are not the applause, nor the silence. You are something steadier. There's a quiet line many of us cross without realizing it. At first, we just want to be seen. Then, we want to be liked. Then, we want to be approved of. applauded, maybe even admired. And somewhere along the way, we start living for it. We bend, we filter, we rehearse. We look outward to decide inward, and we tell ourselves it's just being considerate, just being polished, just trying to do well. But what's really happening is a slow erosion of self. Validation is a natural need. But when it becomes a condition for peace, it becomes a trap. One that keeps us small, disconnected from ourselves, and constantly scanning for cues that we're still okay. This is something I've seen play out many times, often in people who appear outwardly successful. They know how to read a room. They know what version of themselves to present. They receive plenty of praise, but they feel hollow, empty even, because the version of themselves that's being celebrated doesn't feel real. It feels like an act that's been running so long, they can't remember the lines they used to speak. One of my former clients, a high-level executive I'll call David, once described his life like this. I'm applauded for being confident, decisive, in control. But I'm not actually any of those things. I'm just really good at pretending, and every time someone praises me, it makes it harder to tell the truth. That's the thing about performative validation. It can reinforce a false identity. The more we're praised for the mask, the harder it becomes to take it off. This isn't just emotional, it's psychological. Research on self-concept clarity, the degree to which we have a clearly defined, stable sense of who we are, shows that people who rely heavily on external validation often have lower self-concept clarity. They shift more easily, depending on the situation or audience. And while that might sound adaptive, over time it can lead to anxiety, indecisiveness, and even depression. Because we can't feel secure when we're not sure who we are. There's a name for this in identity development theory. Psychologist James Marcia expanded on Erik Erikson's work and described a stage called identity diffusion, a kind of uncertainty or confusion about one's values, goals, and direction in life. And one of the pathways into this diffusion is living too long in the gaze of others, shaping ourselves based on how we're received, not what we believe. It's also worth noting that some of the deepest wounds come not from criticism, but from abandonment, from silence, from indifference. That's what makes ghosting, social exclusion, or emotional withdrawal so painful. It doesn't say, "You were wrong." It says, "You didn't even register." And for those who've grown dependent on approval, this absence can feel like annihilation. There's no clearer example of this than what I see in adolescents and young adults who've built entire identities online. They share their thoughts, their style, their bodies, their beliefs. And when they're met with engagement, it feels like confirmation. This is who I am. But when the comments slow down or the audience moves on, they're left questioning, was I ever really that person? Or was I just becoming who they wanted me to be? This isn't limited to young people, of course. I've met parents, professors, pastors, and professionals who've quietly lost themselves, trying to meet the expectations of everyone around them. They become experts in who they should be. But inside, there's an ache, a dissonance, a sense of, I don't know what I want anymore. So how do we begin to unwind from that trap? The first step is honesty. Not the performative kind, where we curate a confessional for others to like, but the raw, private kind. The kind you whisper to yourself in the car, or write down when no one's watching. The kind that says, I'm tired of trying to be someone for everyone. Next comes disruption. Start doing small things that go against the version of you others expect. Say no when you usually say yes. Let someone see your uncertainty. Post something without checking for the perfect angle. Tell the truth even when it's awkward, and notice what happens, not out there, in here, in you. You might feel fear, but you might also feel something else. Relief. The kind that says, this is mine, this moment, this choice, this voice. We'll talk more in the next section about what it looks like to reclaim your sense of worth, to find validation within, and build relationships that affirm your humanity without requiring performance. But for now, let this settle. You were not born to be consumed. You were not meant to shrink yourself into a version others can applaud. You are allowed to belong to yourself, even if no one claps. especially then. By now, we've taken a long and honest look at the layers of validation, from its biological roots to its digital distortions, from childhood conditioning to the quiet desperation we sometimes feel as adults. So where does that leave us? Ideally, it leaves us here, ready to reclaim something, not just our self-worth, but our freedom. The freedom to exist without asking permission. The freedom to be seen on our own terms, not filtered through applause or rejection. That doesn't mean we stop caring what anyone thinks. That's neither possible nor wise. Relationships require attunement, mutual respect, feedback. But there's a difference between caring about people and depending on them for your sense of identity, between engaging with the world and being owned by its opinion of you. I want to return briefly to something I said earlier. You are allowed to validate yourself. And for many of us, that doesn't come naturally, especially if you grew up without that modeling, without someone saying, "You're enough because you're here, not because you earned it, not because you performed, just because you are." I remember a moment in my own life, not dramatic, not cinematic, but powerful. I had just given a lecture that felt off. I wasn't connecting. I could feel the energy dropping. I rushed through the ending, knowing it didn't land. Afterwards, a colleague came up and said, "Nice job." I nodded, thanked her, smiled. But inside, I knew I hadn't shown up the way I wanted. And for once, instead of clinging to her compliment like a life raft, I went home, sat quietly, and told myself the truth. That wasn't your best. And that's okay. It was strangely comforting. Not because I was being hard on myself, but because I was being honest and kind. I didn't need to pretend. I didn't need someone else to rewrite the moment for me. I could hold it, learn from it, and let it go. That's what internal validation can look like. It's not a chant in the mirror. It's not pretending everything's perfect. It's trusting your own voice, your own compass. It's knowing when you're proud, when you're off course, when you're aligned, and not waiting for someone else to confirm it. So how do we build that? Start by catching yourself in the act of outsourcing your worth. Every time you wonder how something came across, pause and ask, "How do I feel about what I just did?" Every time you wait for a response to feel okay about a message, ask, "Was I being honest, thoughtful, kind?" And when you feel overlooked, remind yourself that visibility isn't proof of value. Practice this often enough, and you begin to shift the authority. You move it back inside. But self-validation doesn't mean isolation. In fact, it allows us to enter relationships with more authenticity. When we're not desperately trying to be chosen, we get to be real. And real connection starts from there. Healthy relationships reflect us, but they don't invent us. They affirm what we already know to be true. They don't hold our identity hostage. They don't make love or respect conditional on performance. They're not threatened by our boundaries. They don't disappear when we're quiet. And they don't require that we shine all the time. If you've never had that kind of relationship, it can feel unfamiliar at first, even boring. When someone sees you clearly and doesn't require a show, you may feel uneasy, suspicious. You might mistake that calm for distance, but give it time. Learn to trust the spaces where you don't have to fight to be seen. They're rare, and they're worth everything. One of the most liberating shifts we can make is from asking, "Do they like me?" to "Do I like how I showed up?" From "Did they approve of me?" to "Did I honor what I believe?" From "Did I fit in?" to "Did I stay true?" It's subtle, but it's life-changing. And over time, this shift allows us to show up not as a version of ourselves that will please the room, but as someone whole, someone rooted, someone not just visible, but seen. So, as we close this conversation, I want to say this to you, whoever you are and wherever you are listening from. Your worth is not a reward. It's not something granted by others. It's not measured by volume or attention or digital footprints. It's steady. It's inherent. It can be trusted, even when it's quiet. You're allowed to want connection. That's natural. But you're also allowed to rest in yourself, to be enough, even in silence. Especially in silence. Let's return to ourselves. Not because we're rejecting others, but because we're remembering the one person whose approval we most need to learn to trust. Our own. If you've made it this far with me, I want to thank you. Not just for listening, but for being willing to go somewhere honest. Because this isn't easy terrain. The need for validation touches a tender part of us, the part that remembers what it felt like to be overlooked, the part that still braces for disapproval, and the part that quietly wonders if we'll ever feel like we're enough. But here's the truth I hope you'll carry with you. You don't have to perform to be worthy. You don't have to chase applause to belong. And you don't need anyone else's permission to feel real. Validation will always matter. We are relational beings. We were made to connect. But the work, our real work, is to let that validation be a compliment, not a condition. To let it reflect something we already believe about ourselves, not define it for us. So if you find yourself today waiting for someone to respond, to notice, to say, "You did well," pause, just for a moment, and see if you can say it to yourself first. If you're reshaping yourself to fit into something, ask if it's a shape you even want to be. And if you're tired from performing, take that as a cue. Not to push harder, but to rest. You're allowed to show up differently. You're allowed to come home to yourself. As we wrap up this episode, I'll leave you with one thought. Validation is a powerful force, but it becomes even more powerful when you learn to give it to yourself. That's not selfishness. That's self-leadership. That's emotional maturity. And it's how we build the kind of relationships, personal, professional, romantic, even public, that aren't built on masks, but on mutual recognition. Until next time, this is The Psychology of Us, and I'm Professor RJ Starr. If this episode spoke to something in you, I hope you'll carry it into your conversations, your choices, and your quiet moments. And if you're looking for more articles, books, or future episodes, you can always find me at professorrjstarr.com or by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. You matter, not because of what you do or who claps when you do it, but because you're here. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.